kind of, especially that fellow that came to preach there, he moves in and he's like, look at this. I got a garden and it's producing. We had put in the work. I say we, Levi had put in a lot of work. We'd always laugh because first thing every morning, Levi would go straight out to the garden. And you could see him out there, and he is just checking out those plants as if, he couldn't understand why we didn't have cucumbers the day after he'd planted those seeds. And then, the next day he'd be looking out, and every day he's checking on that thing, and he would help get rid of weeds and things like that. Sometimes you work it and somebody else reaps. And then sometimes you come along and, Jesus is using this physical illustration to teach a spiritual truth. That happens sometimes. There have been situations where somebody has, maybe it's somebody who wrote a tract or a Bible study. Here's a non-Christian that has studied that. Wesley Simons, who's preached for years, started the Tri-City School of Preaching up in Elizabethton, Tennessee. And they, through that school, trained a number of preachers. Through the radio program that he has, Arise to Truth is the name of it, they have converted so many people to Christ. They've converted, I don't know, last I heard it was like over a dozen denominational preachers to Christ through that program. But Wesley came to the Lord through an unfaithful member of the church who, I think they knew each other, but he gave him a tract, a little pamphlet type tract, and the White Oak Church has used it for years. I think they kind of, maybe a handful of members or a couple of members wrote that. I don't think it was just like one particular preacher that wrote that little pamphlet, but it was in booklet form, maybe 10 pages at most, but it's called, let me remember what it's called. Something is wrong, but the Bible is right. That was the name of the little booklet. I've got one somewhere in my files. Something is wrong, but the Bible is right. And this unfaithful, wayward member gave that to Wesley, and I think he grew up in that Chattanooga area. But Wes, where is White Oak congregation, would you say? What part of Chattanooga? North, maybe? I want to say it's like north. So, what's the sad thing is, to my knowledge, and last I had talked to Wesley, he said that guy that gave him the tract never got right with the Lord. But here's a fellow that he gives him the tract. Somebody or bodies wrote the tract. And so here's Brother Simons. He does his study and he wrestles with it because he was in, I think he said it was Church of God at that time. And he wrestled with that and sometimes even I'm going to prove this guy wrong. But all that just say, one day he shows up at the White Oak Church of Christ in Chattanooga and he says, they say, well, hey, Mr. Tell us your name. And he tells them his name. So it's good to see you here. He says, it says, just to give you a heads up, after service this morning, or we could do it right now, is fine. But I'm here to be baptized. And they say, okay, we probably want to set up a Bible study with you or something. He says, I've done the Bible study. I'm here. I need to obey the gospel. There's some things that we probably would want to talk about, sir. Maybe talk about the church. He says, I understand that. He says, you want to talk about the sin of denominationalism. And that, when we read the New Testament, there's one church. Jesus established one church. And he bought it with his blood. And we've got to abide in that church. And you can't join that church. You've got to be added by the Lord to the church. And the preacher was, I think it was Brother J.C. Watkins that was there at that time. And he said, I'm sitting here going, all the things we'd have covered in a Bible study, he's just spitting out here. So he obeyed the gospel that day. And the rest, as they say, is history. But here's Brother Watkins, that guy just shows up and he's ready. And I've been there before as a preacher where maybe somebody has studied material or they've studied with somebody. Sometimes they've studied, especially in our technologically advanced age. Sometimes they've studied through chats or some kind of digital medium, and they're basically ready. Sometimes it's through a spouse or a significant other or a family member, and they're ready. And sometimes somebody may even look and say, oh, look at that. We thought that person would never obey the gospel, and here comes Brother Chad, and hadn't he done a great work? And I didn't do anything. I just reaping where somebody else sowed. And then sometimes you plant a seed, and you labor, and you sweat, and you study with that person, and it just never happens. And you think, and I tried and tried, I just wore myself out trying to get this person to obey the gospel, and they never did. And then one day you hear from somebody and you find out so-and-so is now brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so. And you realize somebody's reaping where you have labored some. And of course, Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 3. It's not about the person who plants. It's not about the person who waters, pulls the weeds, breaks up the ground, whatever. It's about what? Or whom? God, who gives the increase. And that's Paul's point there. Here's a church, the Corinthian church, and they're some of them are saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, some other ones say. Some of them say, I'm of Cephas, Peter. And Paul says, stop that nonsense. He says, you're of Christ. You're a Christian. And it doesn't matter who planted that seed. It doesn't matter who watered, who labored over it, or who baptized you. He's not minimizing baptism there, and it really drives me crazy when people will go there and try to use Paul's words where he says, I thank God I baptized none of you except for, and he lists off just a handful of people that he baptized. And people say, see, Paul says, I thank God I baptized none of you. Well, he goes on to say he did baptize some of them. But, then somebody will say, well, see, but he says, Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Well, that's true, and yet he went around and he baptized people. Over and over again, you see, where Paul's baptizing them, sometimes somebody else is, but he's teaching it. That has nothing to do in 1 Corinthians 1 with Paul trying to minimize the importance of baptism. He's talking to people that have denominated themselves after different people, and he says, stop. Stop with your little group over here of Paulites, and your little group over here of Cephasites, and your group over here of Apollosites. I don't know what the word is you want to use there. He says, stop that. You are all just Christians. And there's nobody better than anybody else. And there's no preacher that's up here because, look, he did the most work there. And, you could almost see some of those Corinthians saying, well, sure, maybe Paul baptized you, but you know what? He didn't teach you the gospel. Old Apollos did that, and you ought to be giving him his due. And Paul says, or maybe it's the other way around. Apollos baptized you, but Paul did most of the study. You need to give him his due. And Paul says, I'm not doing anything. It's God who's due the glory. So sometimes we reap where others have sown and vice versa. And so Jesus says there in that question, do you say there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? Don't miss the point of that question, though. The main point here of that question for them and for us is lift up your eyes. It's not 4 months, 4 years, 4 weeks. He says, lift up your eyes. The fields are white unto harvest. And you don't have to be a farmer to know when the fields are white unto harvest, what had you better do post haste? Get to picking. You better get busy. Because there are all sorts of things that can happen that will mess up that harvest time and ruin your crop. And so when the fields are white to harvest, well, start harvesting because that's a limited opportunity.
Hey, Chad.
Yes, sir.
I think that statement, the fields are white for harvest, had a twofold lesson there for his disciples, one of which was the Samaritans that appeared to be standing there because they had ran back. The disciples had marveled that he had talked to this Samaritan
I never really thought about that.
He would stand there and look at the Samaritans. And
That's,
he's uttering these words that this gospel that is to preach is not only for the Jews, but it's for anyone that's willing to accept it and obey it.
that's pretty interesting. I don't know that I'd ever really paid attention to that, but yeah. Those Samaritans have come out of the city, and it appears that they're there. And so Robert's point is maybe Jesus is, for the obvious reasons that we pointed out, saying this statement there in verse 35, this question and statement, but perhaps also to deal with some of the prejudice in the minds of those Jews. And he's saying, lift up your eyes. Well, if they lift up their eyes at that exact moment, they look out and they see a lot of Samaritans. But Jesus says the fields are wide unto harvest. And so,
He was apparent too, though, that from the statement that this lady makes, that when he comes, he'll tell us all things. Even the Samaritans knew the basis for authority would be the Messiah, would be the Christ. Even though they're, to the Jews, these are a bunch of crazy, off-the-wall religious people. But they understood.
yeah, the Samaritans had, and there's no doubt the Samaritans had corrupted Judaism. And, in fact, even Jesus is going to make that statement in verse 22, ye worship, you know not what? We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. That's not meant to be ugly. It's just stating a fact. Just in case we've forgotten or somebody may not know, I don't want to assume somebody knows, but the Samaritans originated after the northern kingdom. Of course, you had the period of coming into the promised land under Joshua. They conquer the promised land. They have this period of judges, and there's that, up and down, that cycle of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. And then the people ask Samuel, make us a king. We want to be like everybody else. God tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me, but you know what? Sometimes you better be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. And so he says, you want a king? All right. So they got Saul. And that didn't turn out great. God says, you chose the first king, I'm choosing the second one. I'm going to choose a man after my own heart. He chooses David, then Solomon, of course, and then the kingdom splits. Northern kingdom, Israel, southern kingdom, Judah. But the northern kingdom, because of their unfaithfulness, their idolatry, they go into captivity. They're conquered by the Assyrians. And later on, of course, some 150 years or so later, the southern kingdom will go into captivity as well. They're going to be conquered by the Babylonians. But when the northern kingdom goes into captivity, so many of them are carried off captive by the Assyrians. And so they say, well, we can't just leave the land empty. You got to have people there to tend, till the land and things like that. And so they bring in some foreigners, other captives from other places. They bring in these foreigners. They intermarry with the Israelites. And so you have now a group of people that are half Jewish, half some other ethnicity. And so they became the Samaritan race. A lot of times Samaria was sort of a synonym for the northern kingdom. We call it Israel, Samaria, because that was the capital. We do that today. We'll talk about, well, there's what's happening, what's the news out of Washington. When we're talking, sometimes that's used even in other countries to represent just what's the news out of the U.S. Israel, Samaria, sometimes even call it Ephraim, because that was the biggest tribe. But so there's this intermingling, and they became known as the Samaritans. But the Jews looked at them, oh, well, they're half-breeds. And they would, say ugly things like that. And again, sometimes the Samaritans looked at them very much not necessarily as being like a half-breed or whatever, but they're ugly people. They think they're better than everybody else, and that's what prejudice is. It's prejudging. It's assuming you know something about somebody just based upon maybe a skin color, maybe it's ethnicity. It's assuming something about them, about their character, when you don't know. You're just basing it on whatever. Sometimes we do this today. We'll talk about, well, boy, she must be really dumb because she's blonde, right? Sometimes people do that. That's prejudging, and I know we do that jokingly sometimes, but we'd ought to be careful because that could be offensive to somebody. Sometimes it's skin color. Somebody said, well, this person must be, they think they're better or they're worse because of skin color. Sometimes it's what country they're from, and on and on. But that's what prejudice is, prejudging. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced this, but I know sometimes when I try to talk to someone about the Bible or the church, and they know I'm a member of the Church of Christ or the church, they automatically have a attitude of, I don't want to hear anything you have to say because they've got a idea of the church. I had a lady once that I was talking to, and she said, well, I know what you believe,
Yeah.
in a very, condescending way. So it kind of reminds me of what you were saying about the woman at the well.
There's also spiritual prejudice.
About, we have to be careful with that.
Yep.
Very careful.
There's spiritual prejudice as well, and I've Rob talked about this. Plant. What is this? His expression? Plant, don't pick. I think that was the way he put it. Sometimes we'll assume, don't bother with that person. He's really thick in that denomination. Well, let the Lord do the work. You just plant the seed. But yeah, sometimes people will say, well, you're a member of the Church of Christ. I know about you. Do you? Have you talked to me? Because we're strangers, And I've even told people that before. Sometimes people say, I know what you believe. And I say, oh, do you study the Bible too? What do you mean? Well, you said you know what I believe. I believe the Bible. No. And sometimes you can use that and sort of segue into a conversation at least. But yeah, sometimes people are just shut down because I know. But that can go both ways as well. So I've seen some people, whether again it's an individual, oh, don't bother with him, or that person's a member of XYZ church, don't bother with them, they ain't going to listen. Now, I do sometimes tell people there are folks, sometimes in certain religious groups or whatever, that are just more difficult to reach. But I try to be careful how I say that and say, well, they're challenging. But I'm not going to sit here and say, well, don't bother. Don't waste your time, because the gospel's powerful. And I don't know what it can do. You don't know who it's going to reach. But, yeah, I think a lot of good points there. What else did you say, Jimmy? I was thinking there was something else I wanted to comment on what you had said.
The thing I wanted to say is, just like in the occasion with like Paul when he would teach non-believers, they settled on common ground here about the Messiah.
Yes.
He said, I am he.
Oh, that was what you were saying. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish yours up.
Many times we want to pick out the differences, odd things about different religious groups, but most of the time in the New Testament, they look for common ground and build outward from there.
Right.
And that way you have an open door, a foot in the door anyway, and that's where Christ here, when he said, talked about, she said Messiah, she mentioned that was a key word, because I'm him.
Right.
And then Bible study went forward from there. From up to that point, it wouldn't do as a lot, but now they have common ground, now it's moving forward.
Yes. And that was where I was going. Y'all mentioned the brief history of the Samaritans, but archaeologists have even discovered this, what is often referred to as the Samaritan Pentateuch. And they changed, I'm told, I've not read it, but I'm told that they took out every reference to Jerusalem. And I think as it went, as I heard it, they replaced it with Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. So you can see where they corrupted the scriptures, they corrupted some of the ways of worship or whatever. But as Jimmy was pointing out, she knew about the Messiah. The Messiah, the coming Messiah, was still in there, and so it gave him a common ground. And so instead of just dealing with the differences, he gets to common ground and says, okay, you know Messiah, well, let me talk to you about him. You're talking to him. And so that gives a common starting point. And that's why, I always tell people, if you're going to get into a Bible study with somebody, I say, oh, yeah, don't y'all teach the person needs to be baptized to be saved? Well, I mean, that's what the Bible teaches. No. Somebody said, well, I don't agree with that. Well, let's study about that. And so you sit down and you say, all right, let's go to some verses on baptism. Well, you've automatically started where you're disagreeing. And that's more often than not going to cause some difficulty. But not only have you started where, we're at a point of disagreement, you also have started without establishing a standard of authority and so on and so forth. So a lot of times, you can start a study and say, well, probably, I don't, sometimes I know a person, sometimes I don't, but if I know, I can say, well, you follow the Bible, right? You believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Absolutely. Well, we got to go by the Bible, right? Well, let's talk about that. And so for at least a couple or 2 or 3 different study sessions, here's somebody, and we're in 100% agreement. They're like, absolutely, amen. And then we kind of ease into some stuff where, okay, let's talk about the one church. In a world of thousands of denominations, let's talk about the New Testament concept of one church. And it just, again, I don't claim to have just loads and loads of experience, but in my limited experience, every time, that just goes so much more smoothly when you get into the areas of disagreement once you've established some common ground there. And that you see that from the master teacher himself. But, man, great thoughts there from John chapter 4. I was tempted to try to move through that faster and get into the next question in John chapter 5, but there's just so much good stuff there. Lift up your eyes. The fields are white unto harvest. There's good soil out there, as Jesus talks about in the parable of the sower, and we just got to find it and sow the gospel seed, and God will give the increase. But life is uncertain, so we got to get out there while the fields are white and harvest. Thank y'all very much. We'll have a break before worship.